Well, we're all here. Yeah. Go up today. He's home now. Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Today we are in the fourth Sunday of Lent, and Jesus is at the temple again today. If you remember from last week, we talked about authority, about where does Jesus get his authority, and they found, they ended up not having an answer, one that would have incriminated Jesus in any way. And so they were very frustrated and angry, and they left. And Jesus went on teaching, told some parables. So today, after those parables are over, and they believe later on Tuesday, we're talking about Tuesday of Holy Week, Sunday, Jesus comes into Jerusalem on the donkey, and now he's overturned the tables of the money changers, and then we are now on Tuesday, and Jesus is teaching. Why did they have money changers? What was it the money changers were supposed to do?
Change the money.
Change the money from what to what?
Somebody needed a sacrifice.
They could buy a sacrifice. So they sold sacrifices. Did they do anything else? Probably, since I asked, huh? They gave a bad deal. What kind of money were you supposed to use in the temple? Roman money? Was the temple, were Jews Romans? No.
Did they have a different money exchange?
They did have a different money exchange. There was temple money. There was something called a temple shekel. Remember that word shekel? Yeah? They came in many varieties. There were temple shekels and common shekels and royal shekels. And then there were shekels made of gold and silver and bronze and iron, all kinds of shekels. Good morning. Good morning. Mm-hmm. And so a shekel, how much is a shekel? You can imagine that a gold shekel wasn't the same as a bronze shekel. Well, in the Hebrew system, the money was determined by weight. Our money's not determined by weight. Our money is determined by the shape, and each different shape has a value. Now, we used to be able to get silver dollars or silver coins, and that they all had the same silver composition. The nickels were made of nickel, right? But now a quarter has a silver shell, a thin silver shell, and it's filled with zinc on the inside or another metal on the inside, because we had to do that because the metal value was greater than the value of the coin. For instance, a penny. A penny these days have a copper shell and zinc in the middle. And a penny, when it was all made of copper, had a value of 1.8 cents on copper value. Well, you can't have pennies then that are worth 1 cent when the value of the metal is 1.8. And so what they did was that they redid the composition of the coin in order to adjust for the increased cost of copper. So if you have old copper coins, you can go, well, it's illegal, but theoretically you can take them and to recycling and get twice the value for them, if not more these days. I hear that wheat pennies are very valuable. A wheat penny costs you 10 cents now. So dig out those old coins you have at home. Now, this whole system that we use is different from the Hebrew system because theirs was based on weight. Each coin was about 0.4 ounces, 20 to 25 grams, for those of you who care. I know you don't. But they had a mass, it was the mass of it that determined the value. So there were temple coins that looked like this. Now, a temple coin, a significant thing about it is they were silver, okay? And this would have been an offering that you might put in the coffers at the temple. Notice that there's an image of a bowl here, and some of them had images of the lampstand, different kinds of images like that. But this would have been a shekel, and you would pass that around. And that would have been a temple coin. That was a Jewish or Hebrew coin. And with Hebrew writing on it, that's right. So if you were a Jew, that's probably the offering that you gave. It doesn't mean they didn't accept others, but that might be something that the money changers would do. They might change your weird money from somewhere in Africa to Hebrew money for you to put in the temple.
When you held those up there, the first thing that came into my mind was the wine.
Yeah, Arlene looked at that picture and said, oh, it has the wine chalice thing on it. Yeah.
That makes you think of the Lord's Supper, and it wasn't.
Roman money. What'd you put on Roman money? Caesar. And before there were the Caesars, they had things like Apollo and Neptune and the denarius. Denarius was one of the Caesars, one of the early ones. And denarius is the name of a Roman ruler. But all of them were called a denarius after that coin called a denarius. So a denarius was sometimes translated in the King James Version to a penny. You might see that in some Bible translations, but this is what denarius looked like. Now that was a religious coin.
They're not struck very well there.
They're not struck as well, no, because they were hand struck. Mm-hmm. And some of them would be double struck. So you could change the identity from one to another. Now this doesn't really have anything to do with Lent or Easter or anything else. But I happen to have this. This is a Spanish coin, and this is a Spanish dollar. And it had 8 bits in it. So if the whole dollar was intact, it was worth 8 bits. If you cut it in half, then this is 4 bits. If you cut it in quarters, this is 2 bits. If you cut this one in half again, it was 1 bit. And so these were double struck also. The metals were used for coinage because they could be struck easily. They were not so hard that they didn't hold the images that you would use them when you would strike. So when we talk about bits, something in the Old West cost 2 bits. That's how they got them. Now, I didn't see any evidence that they would actually divide the coins of Rome or of the Hebrews. They did have other coins. There was one called a gira, which was a tenth. It had the value of a tenth of a shekel. And so let's see what some other ones I have here. The talent. You remember the parable of the talents? The talent was then a value of coinage. And a talent was equal to 3,000 shekels. And remember, a shekel is a day's wage. So when the servant was given 10 talents, 10 times 3,000, he was given 30,000 days worth of wages, or 30,000 shekels. So they had bigger ones than a shekel, being like a talent, and they had smaller ones. So if you think about the value of that, and the servant who dug a hole and hid them, that's a lot of money. And I understand now when he says, the least you could have done was put it in and get interest, because that's a lot of money, 3,000 shekels per talent. Then there was also the tetrachim was a Greek coin that was equivalent to a shekel. And so you had the denarius in Rome and the tetradrachm in Greece and the shekel in Hebrew. All of those had equal values, a day's wage kind of thing. So another thing that another incident you remember when the woman anointed Jesus' feet with perfume, and the disciples thought that was just wasteful. The perfume, it says in the Bible, was worth 300 denarii. So 300 days' wages is what that perfume cost. That's almost a year, isn't it? We're getting really close to a year's worth of wages that she dumped on Jesus' feet and then wiped his feet with her hair. So some of this background just gives you an idea of when they're talking about money, the values and some of the terminology that's used. Okay, so for today's lesson, it's called What Do We Owe the Emperor? This is another scripture from Matthew 22. After all the parables that Jesus was instructing and telling about power and authority, after all those parables that Jesus was teaching, we find out that the Pharisees had not been sitting idly by. The Pharisees had gone back, regrouped, and tried to figure out another way that they were going to embarrass Jesus. They wanted to cause Jesus to be put in a situation whereby he was vulnerable. They wanted to embarrass him. And so they went back, talked with their disciples, and plotted a scheme to go back to Jesus and ask him another question that he would not be able to answer without causing this frustration and embarrassment and devaluing Jesus among the people. And so the purpose is to consider whether we give to God our complete allegiance. Remember the first commandment, the most important commandment? Love God with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. And then the second, love your neighbor as yourself. Now those were the commandments that Jesus preached. Oh, there were 10 commandments in the Old Testament. Can you tell me the 10? Some of them? Maybe if we work together, we could get all 10? I think there's only 8 Beatitudes. Could you name them? No? Couldn't do that either? How about the 12 disciples' names? Oh, okay. We don't know all that much, do we?
No, we don't remember that.
We don't remember that much. Okay? You all remember the Pledge of Allegiance? Yeah? Yeah? You remember the order of the presidents? No? At one point in time we did? Do you know all the states? And their capitals? In our educational process, we were taught a lot of political information. And we actually remember a lot of that political information. Now, where did you learn your religious information? Sunday school. As a child. Right? Isn't that a shame? That we don't remember more religious education than what we learned as a child in Sunday school? You didn't get tested on it, so you didn't commit it to long-term memory. But what does that say about our allegiance to God? Where do we put his importance if we don't remember the basics? If you what? All of us know the Lord's Prayer? Many know the Apostles' Creed. Many know the 23rd Psalm. We know where to find the information. I don't accept that on an exam. So there are some things we know, and some things we can remember if we're helped with them. But we have a real hole in what we can call to mind in a time of crisis. Yeah? Maybe you have a favorite Bible verse or two. You might know those, but you don't know a lot more. You know the two most important commands. But certainly, but it's incomplete, isn't it?
My mother sang the books of the Bible.
Your father sang the books of the Bible, and let's say who? Sarah? Was it Sarah that could do that also? Matt, Sarah? Do you know how many books of the Bible there are? 66. How many in the Old? The New? 66 minus the New. You know the New? You'll have to count them. During this sermon, you'll have to count them. So this just goes to show you that what we know, we have not grown with, and it's not been incorporated into our soul in many cases. It's difficult for us to come up with that information. It shouldn't be, but it is. And so, to whom do we owe our allegiance? To whom do we really connect? Many people only know the Sunday school stories as far as they go. It's given in a child's view. It's not given with an adult understanding. And that's a lot of what we've done here in Sunday school. I know because I said, oh, I didn't remember that part of the story or that part of the parable or what that was supposed to mean. And we've had numerous sermons our whole life giving the deeper understanding of the scriptures.
But isn't that why Jesus used parables? To simplify it for the common man?
But the common man isn't his best disciple. The common man may get a point, but the common man is not educated in the, you can disagree with me on that, obviously. Mm-hmm. Jeff is saying he picked common people to be his disciples. And he gave the parables, but then he took them aside and explained them to them. So simply the parable itself was a story that made a point, but he often had to take his disciples aside and tell them what the point was. There was the understanding overall, and then there was the theology that went along with it. And we forget very often to continue to study. We forget that there's always more to understand, more to learn about Jesus and God that can help us to be more like, his disciples here. Some of us come to Sunday school, yes. And there aren't many denominations that have Sunday school for adults. And so their understanding is limited compared to people who work through Bible studies. Now, do most churches have small group studies where that information, you work on that together? Yeah, many churches do. But it's not well attended in terms of their total congregations. And so in general, we have limited ourselves in what we can understand. So where does that bring us in today's lessons? What do we owe the emperor? In terms of knowledge, we know a lot more about our political and cultural society than we know about our faith. General statement. Okay? And to illustrate this, the Pharisees came back to Jesus with the question about, should you pay your taxes to the government? Okay? And this is the story, the incident that we have, verses 15 to 22. We have 7 verses here. Let's read it, and then we'll go back and take it apart. Then the Pharisees met together to find a way to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples, along with the supporters of Herod, to him. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are genuine and that you teach God's way as it really is. We know that you are not swayed by people's opinions because you don't show favoritism. So tell us what you think. Does the law allow people to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" Knowing their evil motives, Jesus replied, "Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used to pay the tax." And they brought him a denarius. "Whose image and an inscription is this?" he asked. "Caesar's," they replied. And then he said, "Give to Caesar's what belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God." When they heard this, they were astonished, and they departed. So that's the words. Then the Pharisees. Well, who in the world are the Pharisees? How many religious groups, Jewish religious groups, do you know about? The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, the Essenes, and the Levites. Well, that's only a handful of the many that were out there. How many subdivisions of political parties are there? As many as there are people, really, right? And it was very much the same way. In the Jewish state, The faith was the religion. And until they were conquered by outsiders, the faith was the religion. It didn't matter, the king was the king of the faith and the king of the king of your political country and the king of your faith. David, for instance, Saul. And so, as long as the Jewish state was intact, their religion was intact. Do you remember that the scriptures were often read at public hearings? You bring all the people together and they would read from the Torah. And so that was the way the state was organized. Well, you always have people who disagree with you within the state or within the faith. We have that all the time. And the Pharisees were simply one group, a relatively small group of people who were in that club. They believed that there were never any more than 6,000 Pharisees. It wasn't as though they lived all over the country either. The Pharisees were pretty much in Jerusalem. There were a couple in Galilee. The Pharisees are talked about for 100 years in the history of Israel. They arose and they disappeared within 100 years. The Pharisees had a political advocate, and that was the Herod family. King Herod and his descendants over that 100-year period. The Pharisees affiliated themselves with the Herodians, the Herod kings, the kings of Herod. And so therefore, they were simply the ones in Jerusalem who came and challenged the authority of Jesus. They were trying to build themselves up by causing Jesus' reputation to be deflated. So we have then, are there Pharisees today? No, there are none. Just during that about 100-year period. So they were simply a group of people of a similar political religious viewpoint.
Well, did the temple have a lot to do with the Pharisees and the Sadducees?
They
Have duties,
no.
and now that there's no temple?
No. The Pharisees, they were higher than peasants but lower than priests. They were simply people who went to the temple and they taught and tried to recruit others to their thinking. Part of the political Sanhedrin. So they were under the king. They were affiliated with King Herod, part of the political scope as well as the religious scope. They were educated, they knew the Torah, most did, yes. Yes, they held themselves above the uneducated, yes. In the absence of the king, they maintained religious rituals and rites during, as well as others. The priests performed them. So they rode the fence between the religious and the political, okay? And so you watch what you did, so that if you were riding that fence, it meant you had some allegiance to your political leaders. And the Herods were appointed by the Romans to be in charge of the state of Israel, Palestine, the Middle East there. So in their appointment, the Herod's appointments, that put them into the political line. But they considered themselves to be educated Jews. Yes. The Herods were, yes, they were Jewish in terms of their religious affiliation, yes.
That's why in one gospel, Pilate says to Herod, well, this is a Jewish thing, so go to Herod. So sends Jesus to Herod.
Well, I think that was because Herod ruled Galilee, and that was under his authority.
That was a different Herod who ruled Galilee than the one who ruled Jerusalem. There were, the Herods was the family name, and there were different Herods in charge of different parts of Israel. So there was a different one in Galilee. And yes, they were affiliated with the Romans. Mm-hmm. So Pastor Jen is saying the Romans didn't care about the religion so long as they got their taxes. And the Herods were the family that did this, who caused the actions of the Jewish people to conform with the requirements of the Romans. There was a poll tax that the Romans instituted. It didn't go for anything except to increase the wealth of the Romans. And that poll tax was the denarius that we looked at earlier. That 1 day's wage was collected by the tax collectors. Tax collectors were Jewish also. They collected the tax from the people, and then that tax went to Rome. But we know that the tax collectors very often collected more than they were supposed to and cheated people in many ways. So again, they were Jewish by birth, but they weren't Jewish by action.
That sounds like modern day.
Sounds like modern day, and sometimes it does. Mm-hmm. But we keep regulating modern day for more accountability for whatever that's worth. So the Pharisees were simply one of the groups that was riding that fence between the political and the religious at the time in which Jesus went to Jerusalem and was crucified. So the Pharisees are trying to discredit him. They are trying to show that he can't, he has to have a bias. And when they asked him where his authority came from, that was to show the bias. And remember last week, Jesus asked back to them, well, where did John the Baptist get his authority? And they didn't want to say from God, because then they didn't believe John the Baptist, they killed him. And they didn't want to say from the government, because the people believed that John the Baptist was from God, that he was a God man, a prophet kind of person. And so they left unsatisfied. So they go back, they congregate together and say, okay, that didn't work. Let's find another way. And so they conspired with their disciples. Did you see that? The Pharisees met together to find a way to trap Jesus in his words. They sent their disciples, along with supporters of Herod, to him. Now, the disciples were the students under the Pharisees. They had people who were, they were teaching their disciples in the same way Jesus had disciples. These were Pharisee disciples, along with the supporters of Herod. The supporters of Herod, that's the political side. So they've got the religious side and the political side. And they send these people to Jesus. Teacher. So they call him teacher, they call him rabbi. That's an acknowledgement of the wisdom of Jesus and of his godliness. They're buttering him up. They're complimenting him. Look at this. We know that you are genuine. Yeah? No, they didn't believe that at all. And we know that you teach God's way as it really is.
They didn't believe that either.
No. We know that you are not swayed by people's opinions. That was true too. Jesus was not swayed by what other people thought, the Pharisees. Mm-hmm. And we know that you don't show favoritism. So we know all of those things about you. You're genuine. You teach God's way. You're not swayed by people's opinions, and you don't show favoritism. You're an upstanding man, teacher. So tell us what you think. Does the law being the Torah, does the law allow people to pay taxes to Caesar or not? So if he says, yes, you can pay taxes to Caesar, what that means is that he's acknowledging the political position and the right of the political leaders to levy taxes. If he says it's okay to pay taxes. If he says it's not okay to pay taxes, then what's that called when you are a person who works against the government? A subversive? Treason? So if he says that they should not pay taxes, he's committing treason. And what do you do with a traitor? You kill them. So if he says yes, he's lost religious value. If he says no, anyway, one way he loses politically, the other way he loses religiously. So either way, they say, we got him. There's no way that he can say yes or no, that he doesn't lose some kind of power, some kind of that's the word, credibility. And so what does he do? Here, knowing their evil motives. So Jesus knew what they were doing. He replied, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Why do you test me? What's a synonym for test? Question, tempt. Why do you tempt me? Now, who else has been tempting him? Satan all along. So this is a question that Satan would love for him to answer. Why do you test me, you hypocrites? Now, hypocrites doesn't have the same kind of connotation that it does for us today. If you're a hypocrite, that is a really bad criticism. Somebody, you have no credibility. It wasn't that bad at this time. At this time, it was simply meant two-faced. You have to, you can't stay on the fence forever. You have to choose one side or the other. So if you were trying to please both at the same time, you're a hypocrite. It's a milder criticism. So, why do you test me, you hypocrites? Show me the coin used to pay the tax. And what will that coin be? Denarius. Why? It's a political coin. A coin of the Roman Empire. Does he have one? Do you know? Does Jesus carry a denarius? I don't know. He just didn't. He didn't mention it if he does, but he says, Judas carried the money for the disciples. He was their treasurer. So he says, show me the coin used to pay the tax. So somebody had a denarius, and they brought it to him, and he said, who's on the denarius? Caesar. Because there was temple coinage also. So if they had brought him a temple coin, it should go to the temple. They brought him a Roman coin, go to the Romans.
Is that the only place they
Is that the only place they spent the temple coins? Probably not. They didn't have many coins at all because there was a lot of barter. But considering how many temple, the shekel would have been a temple coin, and the talents would have been, they would also have been Hebrew or, Jewish coins. Yeah. So if you had a denarius and you wanted a temple coin, you could get it changed over, had the same value.
What law were they trying to catch Jesus up in? Because it feels like it's perspective in a lot of ways. And I don't know if I understand what it feels like there's a deeper part of what you're saying.
The law would have been anything in Leviticus.
Which part would have just been a trap?
Just a trap, yes.
How?
Because, well, it referred to the tithe. The religious law was the tithe, and then that was to be in Jewish coin.
They were relating taxes to tithes.
Yes, taxes and tithes. So give to Caesar that which belongs to Caesar, and give to God that which belongs to God. Now, the coin for the Roman Empire had the Caesar. What in this world has God's image on it? What in this world has God's image on it? Today, then.
We don't know what God looks like.
We don't. But we are created in his image. So as I look out here, I see God's image in every face. Presidents and figures who are on our political coins? Well, theoretically, yes, because they are all God's creations. But it's the point here to consider whether we give to God our complete allegiance. Do we give to God that which bears his image? Me, you. Are you giving to God you? And so there's a number of ways to see this. There is the literal words, but then there's the symbolism of the image of God on every person. Well, I mean the reality of the image of God in every person. We, on our coins, yes, we are on the fence on our coins. In God we trust, yes. Over a president. So how you look at all of this, how you see this, how you look at this challenge brought by the disciples of the Pharisees, how will you interpret it? The Pharisees did not win again, did they? The question on page 34, to what do you give more allegiance than God? And what would it take to reverse the ordering? Are we guilty of giving more allegiance to something other than God?
Isn't that another way of saying idols?
Yes.
I mean,
It's another way of saying idols.
you put before God,
What do you put before God? Yes.
and that can be almost anything.
Can be. And it's one of the, we're called to reflect on giving up something for Lent. When you give up something for Lent, can you give up something that separates you from God, that stands between you and God? And then After all of that, the author of this book, I think, gets a little trivial. She says she's given up TV for Lent. So I guess that means she's watching more TV than she was being in a religious state of mind. And then she says, I've given up TV, but don't ask me how much YouTube I watch. I think that trivializes it. So what do we really give up for Lent? What do we really put aside so that we have a greater allegiance to God? Let's close with the prayer on page 34. Lord, I repent of all the gods I put before you, beg your forgiveness, and seek to do better at putting you first. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.